Thank you for being here today. I want to welcome you to the second webinar of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights Annual Symposium. We're going to be discussing strategies, law, hope, and healing, a roadmap to ending conversion therapy. I want to also say thank you to the folks who joined us for our last webinar, who were very vulnerable with us about their own personal experiences with conversion therapy. If you haven't had a chance to check that out, you can go to LGBTQ symposium.org where you can watch that webinar. We'll have this also available online after the live broadcast. So you can take a look at that along with some incredible resources. And I want to also in particular thank Delta Airlines for serving as the founding sponsor of the 2020 LGBTQ Institute Symposium. We would not be here without you all. So thank you very much to Delta Airlines. I want to first introduce our panelists. Madison Higbee, who unfortunately is not able to meet with us today because of internet connectivity issues. After Hurricane Zeta came through, it's knocked out a lot of power in the Atlanta area. So unfortunately, Madison is not going to be able to be with us. Madison is the graduate student in sociology at Georgia State University, who was able to extrapolate the data around conversion therapy based in our LGBTQ Institute Southern survey that we conducted to really understand the depths of what people are experiencing in the South around this practice. She received her bachelor's degree in sociology this past spring. And so we appreciate the work that she's done and hope that she will be able to add some additional resources to the webpage that we create that includes this video afterwards. Casey Pick, thank you for joining us, Casey. Senior Fellow for Advocacy and Government Affairs for the Trevor Project. It's the world's largest suicide prevention and crisis intervention organization for LGBTQ young people. Miles, who joined us in our first webinar, is back. Thank you, Miles. Impact producer at Multitude Films, an LGBTQ-led independent production company dedicated to telling stories by and about underrepresented voices. Roland Bem serves as on the board of directors for the Georgia chapter. I think I got that right. Of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Appreciate you being here as well. Ashley Robus, who is our senior fellow at the LGBTQ Institute, like Madison, has had some connectivity issues because the hurricane that recently came through. She's a doctoral student in the counselor education and practice program at Georgia State University. So really appreciate all of you being here, lending your voice to this conversation. I want to get into a little bit about what each of your organizations do in more detail. And so I was thinking that, Casey, we could start with you. If you could chat a little bit about the Trevor Project and some of the major initiatives that are going on right now.
Sure. So the Trevor Project, we are best known as an organization that's been around for more than 20 years, providing suicide prevention and crisis intervention services for LGBTQ youth. We have a 24/7 telephone lifeline, text and chat service that is free and confidential, where youth can reach out to us and receive support in moments of crisis. And that is the heart and soul of what Trevor is and does. But it's not all that we do. We also do work with providing direct education to youth-facing professionals and adults on how to best serve the needs of LGBTQ youth and their mental health. We have a research department that is very relevant to the conversation we're having today, because for the last 2 years, we have been putting out the LGBT Youth Mental Health Survey, surveying tens of thousands, more than 40,000 this year, LGBTQ youth, and asking questions about their mental health. And that is where we managed to derive data like 10% of the youth we surveyed this year reported experiencing conversion therapy. And those youth who had experienced conversion therapy, our research showed, were 2.5 times more likely to have attempted suicide in the past 12 months. So our research department is involved in putting out really robust and innovative research that is helpful as we look to demonstrate that conversion therapy is still happening and that it is harmful and needs to be put to an end. And then you've got my department, which is Advocacy and Government Affairs, where we work across the country, federally, state, and in local municipalities to pass legislation and policies to protect the mental health of our community. And as part of that, we do work, we have what we call our 50 Bills, 50 States campaign, which is committed to seeing the practice of conversion therapy by licensed professionals on minors, on anybody under the age of 18, prohibited in all 50 states. Thus far, we have managed to acquire protections in 20 states, including our first state in the South last year, Virginia. And I am so excited by today's presentation and by your work, because we firmly believe that we need to be protecting youth all over the country, in every region, and that we can successfully do this. No place should be left behind.
Thank you for that, Casey. And thank you to the Trevor Project for the great work that you do. Roland, can you tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing in Atlanta and in Georgia with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, but also with Converse, Georgia? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Absolutely, Ryan. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's mission is to save lives and bring hope to those affected by suicide. We do that through a variety of means: education, advocacy, research. In fact, AFSP is the largest private funder of suicide prevention research in the country. We have chapters in all 50 states, and here in Georgia, we're involved in a number of different advocacy projects, including efforts to end conversion therapy by licensed mental health professionals for minors in Georgia. And with that came the development of what we call the Converse Coalition. And if you're interested, you can go to converse-ga.org. You can find information there. And what that is basically a coalition of more than 35 state and national organizations who are working together to secure passage of legislation that would prohibit licensed mental health professionals in Georgia from providing conversion therapy services to minors. It's a collaborative effort, obviously, and we've had the good fortune of being able to work with Casey and her colleagues at Trevor in this very important project.
It's incredible, absolutely incredible. And so you have 50 chapters in all states. You have a chapter in each state, so you have 50 chapters, correct?
We have at least one chapter in all states, and in some states we have more than one chapter.
Okay. That's
Georgia,
great.
just one. Thanks.
Okay. And Miles, can you talk to us a little bit about Multitude Films, and in particular the film Pray Away?
Sure, yeah. Like Ryan shared, Multitude Films is a LGBTQ women-led documentary company that produces films made by and about underrepresented voices. One of the films in Multitude's slate right now is called Pray Away. And it is a film that looks at the history and the continuation of the Pray the Gay Away movement, a movement where people who are searching desperately for belonging, for connection, and trying to live true to their faith at all costs pursue these efforts. While the film seeks to refrain from making a judgment about those beliefs, it nevertheless demonstrates the impact trying to change or manage sexual orientation or gender identity has, despite the good intentions of the many who were and remain involved.
Gotcha. And when will Pray Away be available for folks to take a look at, to view? Is there a date or some point on the calendar that you think that we could maybe expect to be able to take a look at Pray Away?
We don't have news yet that we can share about a release date, but if folks head to prayawayfilm.com, they can sign up. And as soon as we can share that information, it will be in their inboxes. So you can head there. We're also on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram as well, and updates will be posted there too.
Wonderful. So to take us back, our first webinar really described the findings that we had from our Southern survey, which showed that I think 1 in 8 Southerners had experienced some kind of conversion therapy. And I think there was conversations about, well, what is conversion therapy? And I think that there's been the discussion about young people who think they've certainly been told that they shouldn't be who they are, but think that conversion therapy is, electrodes or, those kinds of extreme measures. So Casey, can you explain a little bit about, and we talked a little bit about this in the first webinar, but just for folks who might not have been able to attend, and just as a refresher, the different types of conversion therapy that is out there.
Sure. So at Trevor, we love data, and we wanted to get a sense of that range and how youth felt that their experiences had fit into that. So we actually did ask in our first survey, has anybody ever attempted to change your orientation or attempted to pressure you to change your orientation or gender identity? And to that question, we got answers, basically 2 out of 3 said yes, more than 60%. Of course, that ranges from everything from the youth who did experience conversion therapy at the hand of a licensed professional, but didn't have the vocabulary to call it that, all the way over to your grandmother saying, Casey, why haven't you met a nice boy yet? So that's a wide scope. And that's why we also drilled down a little more deeply into, have you ever had an appointment or met with a licensed therapist or minister for the purpose of changing your orientation? And that's where we got the number of closer to 10% of having experienced conversion therapy. 7% described that as coming at the hands of a religious ministry figure. 5% said a licensed professional. You see how that doesn't add up to 10%, and there's actually some overlap in there. So of people who've experienced either or both. So when I talk about conversion therapy, I define it as any treatment or practice that is intended to change an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity. So this doesn't include hearing a conservative sermon from your pastor talking about marriage being between a man and a woman. It is something that is not necessarily one-to-one, because conversion therapy can happen in group contexts of, mimicking a 12-step program even, but it is a program that is focused in on with the intent of changing one's sexual orientation or gender identity. And it can be in the context of a licensed professional, a therapist, psychologist, that sort of space, or it can be in an unlicensed context, which can be everything from a formal Bible study dedicated to addressing one's sexual orientation, to a life coach, which looks in many, many ways like a therapist, but they are not regulated by the state.
And so in terms of the effects of these kinds of practices, and as an organization that likes data, and I appreciate that, were you able to discern what some of the effects of these kinds of practices are on the young people who are taken through them?
I already mentioned that we found that those who reported experience in conversion therapy also reported a suicide attempt in the past 12 months at 2.5 times the rate of those who had not experienced conversion therapy. These youth were also much more likely to report multiple suicide attempts in the past year. So you're seeing that sort of space. Also worth knowing is that in the data that we've gone through and found, this issue transcends race. It is, in fact, not an issue, as is sometimes stated, of purely white gay men. This is something that actually we see it happening even at higher rates among your trans and non-binary population. And we did see it across different racial backgrounds.
Well, and I think that what's interesting about that piece of it is that the Southern survey that Madison was able to discern and to take that data set, to your point, match that in the sense that the folks who were more likely to experience this kind of therapy were folks who were younger, transgender, non-cisgender, lesbian, Hispanic. She also found that they tended to be less educated and less religious at the time of taking the survey. So I think that becomes a question of, did them experiencing something in conversion therapy practices in the context of a religious context, pull them away from the church? And I think that that's a question that I think Miles Pray Awake starts to explore a little bit, correct?
Sure. I think that it's really important to note something that both you and Casey have already alluded to, and that often, like, where this is happening in families and faith communities, people are not under the impression that what they're doing or supporting or endorsing is conversion therapy, because what they're picturing is its most extreme forms. They're uh, thinking about electroshock therapy. They're thinking about these aversion treatments. They're not thinking about some of the language that gets used are discipleship programs. And that's sort of what I think Casey mentioned around, like, the Bible studies, where they are talking about orientation. They're talking about gender identity. The hope is that you will be uh, changed or fixed, through studying, God's word. But they're never going to call that conversion therapy, and it's not so much with a lot of communities that they're being sneaky. It's that they do not think what they're doing is the same thing. And that's a lot of what the film kind of gets into is how does this take hold in the life of a person? It's a error to believe that a powerful, white straight man is sitting on top of these types of ministries or organizations and holding that power, over poor LGBTQ people. It's often actually LGBTQ people themselves who are leading these organizations, leading these ministries. And so it's really more of a commentary on what internalized homophobia looks like when it's wielded outward. And I think because of that, the journey toward recovery after that does certainly send people away from the church. It becomes such a visceral and frankly triggering space for a lot of people who were trying, to pursue these change efforts, that it no longer becomes emotionally or spiritually tenable to locate yourself in a community that signals so much pain and harm.
Hmm. Thank you for walking us through that, Miles. I think it's interesting to hear that even though all the professional medical associations and psychological associations make it clear that this is a destructive practice, that folks still pursue it and think that it's not doing any kind of harm. Roland, with your work in Georgia, what has been your experience when you're trying to talk to people about the need to end this? What kind of responses do you get?
Get a variety of responses, some just sort of off the cuff responses that aren't necessarily useful. But what we're looking to do, and the reason why we wanted to create this broad-based coalition, is in part to address the issues that Casey and Miles were talking about, to let people know that when we talk about conversion therapy, we're talking about a wide range of practices, some of which are provided by licensed mental health professionals. And in the legislation that we're seeking to pass, what it does is prohibit those licensed mental health professionals from practicing. It does not, on its own, address other means, nor could it, given some of the constitutional protections that exist. But what we find is the other part is that we work to ensure that we're presenting this in part, in large part, as a matter of health and safety of our children. Because there may be people who might be dismissive of LGBT issues and their view that it's some sort of agenda. But when we break it down and say, no, what we're talking about is the state has a responsibility to ensure the health, safety, and welfare of its children. And these types of practices are endangering those students or those children. And so the purpose then of having a coalition that exists, not just of suicide prevention organizations and LGBT organizations, but has a significant presence by medical professionals, both here in Georgia and nationally, as well as faith community elements to it, is designed to say this is not sort of a one and done thing, that we would like you to be thinking about all of our citizens, our young citizens in particular, and how we can address this, because we believe that there is a much broader base of support if we can reframe the discussion along those lines of protecting our children. So far, I've found very few legislators who are not interested in protecting children, or at least uninterested in saying so out loud.
Sure. And so I guess one of the questions I have is, and it was one of the conundrums that came up in our last session, which is if you have a young person who is being in a counseling session with a counselor who is clearly trying to change their sexual orientation or their gender identity, the idea is that you wouldn't want your young person going there anyway if you did find out that's what they were doing. So it sounds like, Roland, what you're also doing within your coalition is making sure that there's counselors who are trained to specifically work with folks who have been through this kind of experience, because one of the trigger points for folks who've their first experience with conversion therapy is counselors themselves, which are supposed to be safe places to go to. That you have counselors who are knowledgeable and understand what folks who have been through conversion therapy might have experienced in order to get them to a safer place faster. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And I think it sort of starts from the basis of not thinking. There's perhaps a tendency among some people to demonize the parents. And I think a little mercy is due. You may have a parent who thinks and believes with their whole heart and their whole faith that their child may be endangered in terms of salvation if they are not receiving what they would believe to be appropriate treatment. And they don't know what the negative aspects of that treatment might look at. So they're going to their clergy and they're saying, I don't know what to do. The clergy similarly may not have an idea. They may say, oh, I know, I can refer you to this person or that person. And so there's two things. One, to try and educate sort of grassroots and up, and the other is trying to educate through those medical organizations. So marriage and family therapists, psychologists, counselors, so that the organizations sort of top down and bottom up are sort of policing themselves. Policing may be too harsh a word, but are raising awareness among themselves about this is not an appropriate therapeutic intervention, and therefore it is not something that we should be engaged in.
Just want to point out to the folks watching that you can certainly put questions in the Q&A chat function as we go along, and we'll certainly take questions from the audience as well. And for our panelists, feel free to chime in if there's something that's on top of your mind. But I wanted to go to Casey to that point about reaching folks specifically in non-traditional communities. I think you said it, that the traditional thinking around conversion therapy is it's gay white men, young men who've experienced it. That's the traditional view that most people have when they hear about conversion therapy, about who's having to go through it. And I think what we've seen in your data and our data is that it's young people, it's transgender folks, it's communities of color. How do you reach out to communities and educate them about this practice as not a good one? How do you do that? How do you reach those communities?
Sure. So starting first with reaching out and having the conversation about conversion therapy in the gender identity context. Because in some ways it feels like for a long time the discussion was changing sexual orientation, and that continues to be a real and ongoing issue. But the Exodus International and several of the major conversion therapy ministries and organizations were in some ways dying out about a decade ago. And unfortunately, it appears now that we are seeing kind of a resurgence in that industry, and a lot of it tied to capitalizing on fears that parents have of their child being gender nonconforming, transgender, or non-binary. And so you're seeing kind of a rebrand, a refreshing, but a lot of it is, to use a Christian term, it's old wine in new wineskins. And it's a lot of the same sort of thought process and attitude, and just as equally condemned by the major medical and mental health organizations. But you have an audience, and from their perspective, a market of scared parents that they're wanting to reach out to, and using language that is, in some ways, it allows them to swing more secular sounding. It's less faith-based, less pray away the gay, more, this is psychology, really. And that's part of why it is so important that we do apply these regulations to the mental health field, because there is a credibility that they get through being government licensed and being professionals and having degrees that makes it sound appealing to these parents who are afraid. And they're afraid for fair reasons. I mean, we know, oftentimes the first thing they know about trans people is not that they are fully capable of living happy, healthy, productive lives. They hear about the disproportionate rates of murder, especially of trans women of color. They hear about the disproportionate suicide rates, all of which are tied to discrimination, all of which things like conversion therapy contribute to. But these people who are looking for a solution, they're scared, and they're having that fed into them. So part of it is simply speaking to the issue, and our communities are getting better now at making sure that we speak out to, that conversion therapy based on gender identity is just as bad and harmful as conversion therapy based on sexual orientation. The other part of it is having appropriate messengers. With regards to reaching out to communities of color, Darren Calhoun is a Black man who has been telling his story of spiritual conversion therapy for a long time. And his story looks and sounds a little different than that which had been raised up sometimes by popular films like Boy Erased or The Miseducation of Cameron Post, which feature white protagonists. So raising up the appropriate messengers matters. And of course, at Trevor, part of what we do is we say, no, this isn't a white issue. We have data.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Casey. And I think it is that disconnect where families may be thinking it's the right thing to do because they are worried about discrimination, yet the very thing that they're trying to get their young person into is discriminatory, and just perpetuates a cycle. So it's really about trying to get that cycle to be broken. Miles, in your experience, what is some of the most effective ways and messages that resonate with folks when you've chatted about this with them, especially in the work that you do? And has there been a message that you feel really resonates with folks?
Yeah, I think to Casey's point, that appropriate messenger piece of this is critical, in part because the vernacular is different from community to community. And conversion therapy as a phrase, while it tracks in the media, is more often than not what is not being used. And so I think a part of those appropriate messengers contribution, to this work is figuring out, what are the values of these communities? What do they care about? More than just what we imagine, they're against, what are they for? And is there a possible way that we can find alignment? We can find some type of energy. So, for example, in communities that are in a position where they do not believe they will be able to change their belief about the definition of marriage or what gender identity is, they still have the space to be able to speak out against LGBTQ bullying. They can respond pastorally to LGBTQ homelessness, and they can start to speak up about suicide prevention. And so I think to the extent that you really kind of raise the profile of, and I'm thinking specifically of Christian communities here, that teachings and Jesus's teaching specifically should lead to life and not death. and that's paired with the data that's already been mentioned here, you can really begin a generative conversation about the limits and the boundaries, of where a community believes they can go in thinking about sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts. And so that is usually the starting point, is really just kind of locating what does this community care about, how do they conceptualize their identity, and what are the practices that come along with that. And if it can be demonstrated that supporting sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts actually counters that identity, then you really have the room to start doing some work together. And so I think the surprising partnerships are really a big part of how we make true change, on this issue.
And I think to
Absolutely.
follow up with, sorry, with Miles, the sort of right messenger works both ways. So when you are out talking with people who are not inclined to be supportive of the legislation, that you don't show up. I mean, for me, it works. Here's a cisgender white heterosexual middle-aged male, and I show up to people, Baptist Mission Board, Concerned Women of America, whatever it might be, and I'm not there to explain why they are wrong and while their faith holdings are wrong. I'm there to try and find at least one point of contact. In that Venn diagram, you don't have to believe everything that I believe, but are there points where we touch, and can we build on those points? Because you also have a concern for life. You also have a concern for children. You also have a concern for what our communities look like. And you have a responsibility, or can play a responsible role in that. So finding those touch points, I'm finding, is much more helpful than sort of each of us standing on our respective mountaintops and explaining to the other while they're idiots.
Yeah, and I just want to touch in on something that has come up a couple of times, I think, in the conversation. The name conversion therapy, why we call it that, and why we hold on to that, even though as a person of faith, I think it's an abuse of the word conversion. As a person who believes in science, it's not therapy. But as an advocate who's been working on this issue, I have observed two things that make me willing to continue to use that term. And the first one is our opposition, the people who are engaging in these practices and who have created an industry around it in some contexts, they rebrand all the time. So if we try and keep up with them on what they're calling it and what they're willing to acknowledge it, we're chasing our tails. And they're also really good at branding it in ways that make it sound innocuous. Right now, they're talking about therapeutic choice. Sounds like a wonderful thing, but it doesn't get to the story. The other side of this is so much of the challenge in trying to protect our youth from these practices boils down to informing people that it's still happening, that it's real. And so we have finally gotten to a place where we have media and storylines that are telling the stories of why conversion therapy is harmful. And those things need to find their way around a label. And they've settled on the phrase conversion therapy, which does leave us in some challenges. Because I just listened to an oral argument at the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals yesterday, where one of the most prominent conversion therapists in this country, a man last name of Doyle, was claiming, well, this law against conversion therapy doesn't apply to me. I don't do conversion therapy. While he is very much trying and aggressively fighting for the right to attempt to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity through therapy. So there's an awkwardness there, but if we're going to raise the profile of an issue, there has to be a name to slap on it. But it does leave it on us to explain that what we mean is any treatment or practice that attempts to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. And thankfully, that's what the laws actually say.
And that was going to be one of my questions, because when this person is going before the court and saying, well, I don't do this, there is a standard for what is conversion therapy, correct?
Yes, it's that, in legal terms, a priori. You go into it with an intent of what you're going to get out of it. So intent to take a person who identifies as gay now and have them come out of it identifying as straight. Or, also intentionally trying to change their expressions or behaviors to make them more stereotypically masculine or feminine. But it is about that what conversion therapy is not is very explicitly defined in all of these laws. It is not therapy that allows for coping, for identity exploration. We hear this all the time. Well, how am I going to help this child who comes to me and wants to and is confused and wants to talk through what does it mean that I have these feelings? That's absolutely what therapy is there for. It's just not meant for the therapist to have an end goal to impose on the client or to attempt to pursue the client's goal. We hear this all the time of, well, this is about self-determination. The client wants to come out of this as a straight person, so the therapist has to help them achieve that goal. There are boundaries of what therapists can and cannot do. A therapist cannot ethically tell you that, at the end of our therapy, you will be an elephant. That is not a thing that can occur. So a therapist can say, I can help you to be more comfortable with your identity and to reconcile these things, or to explore where your distress is coming from. But we have demonstrated in court, it is fraudulent to attempt to do something which science says cannot be done.
Now, I wanted to get to one of our first questions, and that is there anything that can be done to protect adults from conversion therapy in addition to minors?
I think if you build on sort of what Casey was saying, you don't have the legal platform, if you will, to go out and say, well, I'm going to impose this restriction on everyone. The state stands in a protective form for the children. However, we give agency generally to adults to make their own decisions. But what this process looks like, this advocacy looks like, in addition to the specific legal provisions, is that education effort, both for the population and, more importantly, for the organizations, the therapists, the psychologists, and others, so that internally they can also help to police, which is, it doesn't matter whether you're a child or an adult, as Casey was pointing out, you never go into a relationship with your client with an end goal in mind that they will be X. So, part of the process is this constant education or re-education among members of the profession that this is not an appropriate use of the medical training and of the state-sanctioned licensing that has been provided to them. I'm sure Casey and Miles have some other thoughts on it as well.
Sure. Yeah, I touched on the idea of fraud. And so while the bills that we're trying to pass are preemptive bills, sending the explicit warning of if you are a licensed professional performing this on minors, you are actively at risk of losing your license. We can do that because the government has, as Roland said, has a special role in protecting minors. And the government has a duty of regulating the medical profession. That's a thing that it's been doing for a very long time. But there are other ways of offering up protections. I think about the Jonah lawsuit, in which you had adults who were subjected to conversion therapy by a religious unlicensed ministry, who made concrete, serious promises saying, do our program, spend X amount of money with us and time with us, and you will come out of this with an outcome. And they were able to successfully demonstrate that the practices done there were unethical and deceptive. And so that was a successful suit that you were able to take to the courts. And every state has a baseline business fraud statute. So, and I know that I have friends over at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, Lambda Legal, and other LGBT legal organizations who would be very happy to talk to potential plaintiffs in that space. I would also point that this is really a space where education does come in handy, and things like the Pray Away film will be crucial just to informing those pastors so that they don't advise members of their congregations to attempt this, informing those individuals themselves of being able to hear from others who have walked that road, who may have a very similar story to their own. So education, it may sound like it's toothless. In some ways, it's the most powerful thing we have.
And Miles, to Casey's point about the film and part of that education piece, Can you walk us a little bit more through the concept of the film and what spurred it on in terms of its creation?
Sure. Yeah, I think the there. I think one of the reasons is so powerful, something that uh, we'll be able to see in the film is former leaders of this movement, people who started kind of the pray away, at least in its pop expression movement, all describe kind of their origin stories. You know, what brought them to the place where this felt like what they needed to pursue. And one of the reasons that is so powerful is because something that is very common in the narratives of former leaders as well as countless survivors of conversion therapy is this idea that this is about me and my individual personal relationship with God. That by pursuing these practices, pursuing these efforts, it is going to be what needs to be done in order to maintain this relationship that I have with God. And sometimes it's about, you know, the relationship I have with my family and the relationship I have with my community. But there is this hyper focus on me, change me, fix me. And I think what we can really do to sort of prevent an adult pursuing these practices is to help demonstrate that it isn't just about if an individual can white knuckle it through these experiences. If one person, if you are able to endure all of the psychological and the spiritual devastation that is happening, this is about an entire group of people who is being um, targeted and singled out as morally inferior, as uniquely broken, irreparably damaged, unless change is actualized. And I think when a person starts to realize that it isn't just about them, and that there are going to be countless people who can't white knuckle it through their experiences, who haven't been able to do that, it really sort of shifts the reasons why somebody might uh, think about going through these practices. It puts in perspective that this is a movement, it has a history, that even though it rebrands and it changes names, it's all kind of the same thing with the same outcome for the majority of people. And so that is, I think, one of my own personal hopes for the film is that it really puts that into perspective. That this is not an individual piety thing. This is a targeted, collective harm, you know, that is happening to a specific group of people.
And to that point, for folks who've been through this, is there a national organization for people who've been through this? To that point about having, you know, if a number of folks who go through this oftentimes have it happen to them in adolescence, is there an organization they can go to find support as an adult?
There are several and a growing community of survivors who are coming together, finding ways to connect and share each other's stories. I would point to at the National Center for Lesbian Rights as an organization called Born Perfect that is one of my advocacy partners, but also is made up of a significant number of survivors. There's various Facebook groups I've found, Conversion Therapy Survivor Network, etc. So there are groups and survivors who've come together to find each other that way. And of course, it starts with doing whatever is best for one's own individual healing as well. So in some cases, I've heard from survivors that being in community with other survivors is difficult and challenging and even triggering. So for those folks, replicating almost that same sort of support group format is hard. So before anybody would reach out for that sort of scenario, I'd, tell folks to really have a sense of themselves and what their framework is and their support structure. But there are others out there. And most importantly, I would say is that there are a lot of survivors who've come through this and who have found themselves ultimately living happy, healthy, and consistent with their gender identity, sexual orientation lives.
That's great. And Miles, thank you for putting those two hyperlinks into the Zoom chat. And for those watching on Facebook Live, these resources will be available also on the page in which we also put this recording. So please know that that will be forthcoming. And again, if you have questions for the panelists, please send them in the Q&A chat function or just in the chat, and we will get to those. But I wanted to kind of come back to the idea that all the work that you all are doing is really about some of this heart and mind work. So how important is the heart and mind change work that is being done alongside the legislative movement to ban these destructive practices? How important is that?
That's what I think is critical. As an attorney, the great frustration of any law is that first somebody has to be hurt before a law can come into effect to offer up justice. We hope that the laws that we're passing will also be preventative, that a parent who is considering putting their child through conversion therapy or sending them to that ministry they heard of out of the corner of their ear will also hear, oh, my state just banned licensed professionals from doing this because they say it's harmful. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should find some alternative. So we think about that. We know that in the process of trying to pass legislation, we do a lot of education work. The Converse Coalition in Georgia has been doing great work on holding hearings, even if those hearings don't have a vote tied to it, and just on getting the message out. And that's the sort of thing that can also really start a conversation, not just about the practice of conversion therapy and, in the areas that we're able to legally prohibit it, but it can really have a conversation about the nature of sexual orientation, gender identity, who we are, and how we relate to each other. And so that's the important conversation. It's also the part of this where the numbers of people who have gone through conversion therapy may be objectively small. If I'm talking about 10% of a population of about 3%, that's a small objective number. But the impact of it still being legal and actively pursued today to use science or religion to try and change someone's sexual orientation, that undercuts all of the arguments for equality and equal dignity of our community. And so when we're able to say, no, we're sending a strong message that conversion therapy and trying to change people is not acceptable, we're also saying we are people who deserve equality. And so this is fundamental to everything the LGBTQ movement does to try and create better lives for our future.
And to follow up on Casey's comments, the conversion therapy advocacy is a springboard to greater education, greater understanding on behalf of, if you will, there's both two sides on both sides. What we were able to do with Converse and, for example, at the hearing that we had, is when we concluded that hearing, there were a number of conservative members of the panel who sort of expressed the view that we ought to just ban all conversion therapy, whether it's done by clergy or, so we had to explain, that that's going to be problematic, but we appreciate your thought. We appreciate sort of the reaction of it. And then it also allows us to be able to come in and have further conversations, and two in particular that sort of were relevant this past session were, there was a bill that was dropped that was proposing to ban accepted and expected medical treatments for transitioning youth, and to be able to come in there with the same group of people, because it's not, once again, it's not just LGBTQ organizations, it's a broad base. And in fact, in this one, we really wanted to lead with a medical group, and we were able to get the Endocrine Society and Medical Association of Georgia and others to come in there and say, no, right? This is not experimental. This is not, right? This is what we expect. And let us clarify for you all of these, horror stories that you're hearing about children getting surgery at 8 years old or something. That is not right. But here is what is right. Here's what's happening. Here are the safeguards that already exist. We share the concerns that you have, that, no child be forced one way or the other. And we believe those safeguards are already in place. The other one was, in tangentially, a bill that moved nowhere, just like the bill that would ban medical treatments for transitioning youth, was the one that was looking at sort of banning trans athletes, people who transitioned from participating in, the high school sports of their chosen or their selected of their gender. And to be able to say, if you think that somehow this is a devious plot by people to try and get athletic scholarships, man, you're asking those children to bear a lot on the off hope that they might get it. This is not, you're asking them to subject themselves to some of the things that Casey was referring to in terms of, rejection by society, in terms of, higher suicide attempt rates and others. No, right? This is a person, what we're trying to say is, can we learn to accept and understand sort of chosen orientation, chosen gender identities, and move forward with that we don't try and think that somehow one or the other is trying to pull something over. And so to be able to have a conversation that's rooted in facts, in medicine, in just sort of common sense, if possible, I think serves us well, and is the beachhead that sort of allows for these broader conversations that may not be legislation-led efforts, but that is advocacy at its best in terms of creating education and understanding in our communities.
So to the point about the messenger, Roland, as a cisgender, straight white man, being able to talk to some of these legislators who, fortunately or unfortunately, do make up the majority of the people who are making laws. And so to have you being there to talk to them about this issue is really important. I do know personally, in having worked with, lawmakers who are, predominantly cisgender and white, that again, it goes back to the concern that when we talk about heart and mind, that in this moment, not everyone believes in science, and not everybody believes that this is a problem. And so it really goes back to having conversations that appeal to the heart, because, I think some folks mentioned in the movement for equal marriage, when we were talking about it as an equal right to have, it didn't really move the general population. When we started talking about love and why can't I love someone and be married to someone that I've spent years with, that moved people. And so I think there's a need, to your point, Roland, about making sure that people are sharing their personal experiences. Casey, you were going to mention something?
Yeah, no, just following up on that these stories that get told and how we connect with folks. My professional background before I came to Trevor, a lot of my expertise was on trying to make the case for LGBTQ equality to conservatives and people of faith and Republicans. And one of the things that's important to know is that this issue really has proven to be bipartisan. Of the 20 states where we have laws in effect, nearly half of those were signed by Republican governors. Almost every chamber, so state house or state senate, that has voted on a conversion therapy ban has done so with bipartisan support. One of the exceptions, there are two exceptions. One was California, the first one passed, and the second one was Hawaii, where the chamber didn't have any Republicans in it. So that just kind of signals to you just how bipartisan this issue is. And a lot of it really does boil down to nobody wants to actively harm kids. The stories that our survivors and our data can tell about the harm and the after effects of conversion therapy are tremendously powerful. The other side simply isn't credible, especially in situations like the film Miles is promoting, Pray Away, where you have so many of the leaders in the industry after a certain span of time come around and say, you know what, no, it really didn't work. So you have a lack of credibility there. But you also have just a broad network of people who are willing to step up and say this isn't right, whether it's the medical professionals who say this isn't how our profession works, on over to parents. Probably one of the most powerful testimony I saw in Virginia when we were working on this through regulations was a mother and son who both testified. Now, the son told a powerful story about his own experience as a survivor and his after effects of it. But the mother talking about how she was told that this would be good for her child, that this was a loving action, and how in reality, the conversion therapy itself drove a wedge between them because the therapist tried to blame the mother and actively attacked the mother for the outcome of her child being gay. And so we have so many parents who are trying to do well by their kids, who are trying to be loving, and instead find themselves in a situation that they deeply regret. And that's probably one of the most powerful stories I've heard. And you talk about not just science, but the heart. This issue, we are strong on both.
Yeah, I would just add a kind of short and sweet sentiment, here, and that's heart and mind change is essential to this work because as long as homophobia and transphobia exist, conversion therapy in some form will continue. And so if we can't get these stories and these narratives out there, it's fine to and so I think that the legal strategy has a wonderful engine behind it, and I'm excited, for all the different ways that now the narrative strategy is really a lessening, and all organizations and survivors are working with one another to really advance peace of what we're doing here.
And to build on what Casey was saying, at least I don't perceive our advocacy role is to point out why they are wrong, why they are bad, why they are terrible, people who don't support. I think our advocacy function is to explain, is to educate, is to help understand. And it works. You're talking about the messenger. I've gone in and some people have said, you don't look like what we were expecting. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I guess. And the ability to sort of, they said, do you mind if we start with prayer? And I said, should I lead? And they're like, you pray? It's like, yes. Guess what? We're very much human, like you. We are people of faith, some of us, and we believe that what we are doing is not trying to point out why you are evil or bad, but try and, I view it as a failure if I can't get you to start to understand a little more, that it's my responsibility to get you to a point where you can understand and say, yes, consistent with my beliefs, you're right, this is where we should be going.
Roland, thank you for that. And I think that's a really key point about in any kind of change work, it's about meeting people where they are and finding that common ground. And I think that's really, really key. And we are running short on time. So I just wanted to ask a final question of you all. In your opinion, what can individuals do to help support banning conversion therapy?
I've got the easy option. Go to thetrevorproject.org/50B50S, stands for 50 bills, 50 states. That'll get you logged into our website, helps you get educated more about the studies and the data and the experiences, but it also lets you sign up to become aware of when there's a bill in your state and maybe we need you to contact your lawmaker. So hit up my website and join the effort.
And I'd follow up on that. I'd reiterate, go to the website, sign up, because how you can do it, you can participate in the process itself. You can participate through discussions with your representative, with becoming involved in local efforts that are looking to do this, and for, in a sense, being a witness as you move forward. That you may actively seek out uncomfortable, not dangerous, but uncomfortable situations, so that you can sort of present an alternative view, that you can explain perhaps why their fears might be unfounded or ill-founded, that you can be active without being hateful, aggressive, anything of that nature. But as we said, sort of rapid in the language that they might be more comfortable in, because it's language that we are comfortable as well. Love, right? Acceptance, equality.
I think just to add to that, for folks who either are a part of or helping to lead one of these churches I've mentioned who isn't in a place to change, ultimately what they believe about sexual orientation or gender identity, I have just encouraged folks to talk to their pastors or talk to their staff about how they're going to present their teaching on sexual orientation and gender identity, because most of these leaders are not in a place where they are actively telling people you should pursue conversion therapy, but they're leaving the congregation's imagination to go there.
Mm.
American Christian culture largely supports this kind of theology and these kinds of teachings. And so people on their own are going to pursue these practices. And so I've asked Christian leaders to explicitly say, I do not support conversion therapy. This may be what I believe on the topic, but under no circumstances would I ever encourage an LGBTQ person or a parent of an LGBTQ person to pursue conversion therapy. Making that clear, explicit statement, I think, goes a long way in ensuring that the harm can end.
Roland, Casey, Miles, thank you so much for spending an hour with us today. Thank you to everyone who joined us. And thanks for folks on Facebook Live who are watching as well. As I said before, this broadcast will be available within the next week, along with some of the resources that we mentioned here. And we hope that you all will be able to join us in 2021 as we start to think about additional programming around this topic. But for now, thank you so much and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks.
Thank you.